Hello and welcome to In Search of the Crystal Skull, an epic adventure into the world of mediocrity. My name is Aaron,
My name is Patricia.
and today we are going to go into not the that particular crystal, but another type of crystal. It is the Dark Crystal.
Yes. And it's been a while since we've covered anything fantasy related. The last time that we did was all the way back in Fantasy Month last year.
I think it's Insanity Month. Yeah, this is the movie that I think is going to definitely take us back into the fantasy realms of things. And so, yeah, we have got The Dark Crystal, which is a 1982 dark fantasy film directed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz, and it also stars Stephen Garlick, Lisa Maxwell, Billy Whitelaw, Percy Edwards, and Barry Dennen. So, I mean, starting with the plot. So, basically, this takes place on a blighted planet that is gone 1,000 years in time, and a powerful crystal basically was cracked by two races, and so basically we got two bunch of rival races that on this planet. There are the good guys that are known as the Mystics, and the cruel people who are known as the Sketsis. So imagine Autobots and the Skepticons, except more fur and less robot. So
Yeah, pretty much.
yeah, so there's going to be this thing called the Great Conjunction that's going to take place, and so there is a prophecy that the Gelflings, as they're called, are going to basically thwart the Skeksis and effectively, restore power, restore balance to the universe. But obviously, the Skeksis don't want this, so obviously they go around and kill virtually all the Gelflings, and then to the point where Jen is basically the sole survivor of this race and is taken in by the Mystics and raised like one of their own, and then the prophecy comes along that Jen must go forth and eventually find the crystal shard and place it back into the dark crystal and reunite balance to the world. So that's basically the basic of the story. So, Patricia, I don't know how you feel about the plot of the Dark Crystal.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a pretty basic plot involving with like some magical MacGuffin, and there's this chosen one who's supposed to bring peace and prosperity back into the world. So it's nothing that we haven't seen before. It's nothing like, we've seen this with like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It's like, okay, we have this one guy who is not a hero, and he is tasked to get this MacGuffin over to something else right before chaos ensues from this other evil being. So yeah, it's something that we've already seen before.
Yeah, it's just it's so I mean I think that's the one thing I think that's a bit sad about this is because the Dark Crystal, at least from a plot perspective, tries to give you some intrigue of like trying to invite you into this world. The problem is that they don't really explain it properly.
Yeah, they start off with this long narration, which in a lot of fantasy films it's to be expected, where, it explains about this is the world that we live in, and thousands of years ago it was in peace, but then one day we have these creatures coming about and disrupting everything, and thousands of years have passed, and everything is in disarray, and now there's this one person who is chosen to bring everything back to normal, and they explain it in, in terms of like, okay, you have the crystal who pretty much has all the power of bringing everything back into prosperity, and then the crystal shattered, and then you have these creatures divided into two, the mystics and the Sketsis. And the Sketsis pretty much rule everything. The mystics are just there, and they are prophesizing that a Gelfling will take the initiative of finding that lost crystal shard and putting it back. And yeah, I mean, like it explains everything, and then you have the characters re-explaining again. So it over explains, but at the same time, there's a lot of under explaining. Like there's some things that we see throughout the course of the movie that doesn't get answered.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it over explains. I think what it does repetition. Like it seems to have this idea that people are going to be like sat down in the theater for like the entire movie. So it kind of like in a way it kind of feels like it's kind of like a TV show in a way. Like it's explaining one thing in one act and then explains the same thing again in the second act, and then you get to the finale in the third act, and it just feels more like this was kind of like was written for like a TV show than it really was for a movie the way that
Mm.
it feels like it's all paced.
I mean, to be fair, this is the very first non-Muppet movie that Jim Henson had a real eye on wanting to create this huge world. Like, there's this entire story Bible called The Crystal, where he wrote down in depth about the entire world and its inhabitants and all the plants and creatures and everything like that. Like, he really wanted to build this into like this huge, massive world, akin to like how J.R.R. Tolkien was able to build his, world in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit books. And I guess, yeah, I mean, it's been a long time since I've read my friend and colleague Hassin's book about the behind the scenes of Dark Crystal, where he actually interviewed many of the people who worked on the movie and got an in-depth analysis onto the behind the scenes of the making of it. I don't know whether it was pitched to be a TV series, but I know that from what I understand, after that Jim Henson was done with the Great Muppet Caper, he wanted to do a lot of projects outside of Muppet stuff because at that point in time, he was well known for doing Muppets and Sesame Street. So he wanted to go back into his roots where he did a lot of interesting experimental films, and this was one of them. I mean, it's a pretty ambitious project because it's one of the first films that doesn't have people in it. It's just all puppets. And so he wanted to create something along the lines of, hey, let's just do the Muppets, but instead no people and make the story a little bit more darker and mystical. So, yeah, he wanted to break barriers with doing this movie, and he was really passionate about it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, at least in my opinion, at least in regards to the plot, I think while he probably has put a lot into the Bible, the problem is that I think only certain amounts of the Bible actually ended up on the screen.
Mm.
And that basically ended up being the problem, I think, with this movie, because like the world itself doesn't actually get explained to like what it is and everything. Like, we're just told here are these Skeksis, here are these mystics, here are these Gelflings, and here are a few other creatures like thrown in between. And then you got Arthur, who like is just like I guess is supposed to be some kind of like Yoda character, I guess. Which obviously, but then she doesn't get all that much time on the screen to kind of like do that. And on top of that, like we were talking about harpy boobs before, as a joke in one of these things. Yeah, with Arthur, you can kind of notice, a lot of going on in the chest area when you first look at it. And unfortunately, you can't ignore it. It's just there.
A lot of these they try to cover it up, but no, it's like right there, right in front of your face.
Yeah, I just don't understand it, and just on top of that, like, Algra, this character, I mean, like, is really kind of confusing because, like, she, ends up trying to help, Jen, in the first bit of the second act, and then in the toward the end of the second act, she ends up going to the Skeksis and say, well, why didn't you just come to me and say, why you wanted the shard and yada yada yada, almost like she was like saying, oh, well, hey, well. I would have helped you. I would have been like, what? It's like yeah, I can understand that, she wants to basically get back at the Skeksis because obviously they destroyed her house and everything. But I mean, the fact that she was willing at one point in the story to like, say, oh yeah, I'll betray, the Gelflings and help you out with your plan for world domination, but not anymore. It's like it's just yeah, that felt kind of weird.
Yeah, that does feel kind of weird. It's like, if you want to know where the Gelflings are, they're gone already, but, you should have come to me. That way, I could have helped you with the crystal, but instead you destroyed my house. And yeah, that was a little bit odd in the second act. And then in the third act, she helps out Kira with saying, "Oh, you have a gift. Let out all these animals so that you can be free," and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that the whole motivation of Agra is that, oh yeah, she's supposed to be like this mystical old being that who had the shard this entire time, and she was just waiting for the Gelfling to come along and fulfill the prophecy. And then all of a sudden she gives it to him, doesn't have time to explain it because then you have these like what these like scorpion dung beetle roly-poly-esque creatures coming about and destroying everything so that they can get the Gelflings and then bring it back over to the Skeksis so that they can be able to continue ruling forever and ever.
No, no, it's just this. Yeah, I can understand what they were going for, but yeah, they were just kind of weird.
Yeah, let's go over some of our characters. So, our main protagonist in this series is Jen, who is the last Gelfling, and he was raised by the Mystics, where he was essentially brought up after his family was killed off by the Skeksis, but he isn't told much of anything about his prophecy, considering he's the very last Gelfling in the entire world. He isn't told by his master about like, oh, you are meant to do this, you're meant to do that, and you have to go to Agra and you have to put the shard into the crystal. He's just going about mumble jumble like any other wizard, saying like, you must follow the sun, find Agra, and then you will know what to do. It's like, no, he doesn't. You didn't tell him
Yeah,
anything.
it's just so crazy, and Jen is such a bland main protagonist in this. He's almost like a video game hero in a way, like the control kind of comes from you. Like, unfortunately, like it isn't, they didn't really build much character into him. He basically just is hero effectively. Like, he's there, he's got the crystal, he goes through like some angst. He has a love interest, and then he gets like a comical like third character that comes along that hey kids buy the toys, and then yeah, it's just so underwhelming. This Gen character. I'm so sorry, but I there's the thing about this as we go along. I know there are some hardcore fans of the Dark Crystal, and don't get me wrong, if you enjoy it, then good for you. And I know that there was a continuation of this story, and I know it's garnered a bit of a cult following through over the last couple of decades. But I've got to be honest with everybody, like from what I've had from like our characters and what our plot so far, there's not really much to get my teeth into.
Yeah, I mean, they do
And that
explain his story, but the problem is that when he meets up with the other Gelfling, Kira, when they shake hands with one another, their stories are explained at the same time, back to back, where we see that Kira was hidden in a tree by her mom after she gets killed off by the Skeksis, and then she's found by these podlings, and then she was raised, and then you have another bit where you have Jen being raised over by the mystics and learning how to read and count numbers, and they are going on simultaneously. And it's really confusing if you're not paying attention.
Yeah, it's like when they have the handshake, it almost kind of sounds like oh, through that handshake alone, they knew all about each other. Like it's
Yeah.
just it's so strange. Like why not just have it like oh hey, my name is Jen. Hey, my name is Kira. Like how did you get here? And then you just explain the entire story through that, and then do like the whole like scene shifts through that. Like it's they could have done that through the epilogue as well, like with Jen, like they could have shown scenes of like him, like his family being killed and him being rescued by the Mystics and them being raised, and they could have done all that in the epilogue effectively, and then build some sympathy for this character right off the bat. And then there would have been like some chance to have sympathy with the leader Mystic and Jen to like say hey these guys had a relationship for a long time, and now he's died. Now he's dead, and now you could have hit like a really good note on the very beginning of that if you had provided an epilogue rather than providing narration. But they didn't do that, and
Yeah.
so that's a problem with this
Yeah, I
movie.
mean, there's a reason why the term show don't tell is always emphasized whenever that we have too much narration and not enough showcase of what the plot should be presenting.
This movie kind of doesn't feel like the first movie. It kind of feels like a sequel, and like you have the narrator kind of like explain to everybody what happened in the first movie,
But
effectively.
no,
Like
this was not a sequel. This was the first installment. We wouldn't get a prequel until like almost 30 years later on
exactly,
Netflix.
exactly, yeah. But I mean, here's the thing about this. Before we go any further in this discussion, we're not going to go into like future projects like prequels or sequels or whatever, or like this book or that book or chapter 5 of this fan fiction that's been written by Gonzo fan 1973. Like let's just focus on like the Dark Crystal 1982, and let's just focus on that as a project.
All right then.
Cool. Okay, so in regards to our other characters, so we have Kira, and unfortunately, like the first thing I said out loud was like, "Oh, hey, here comes the love interest,"
Yeah,
and
and you're
she
pretty much
is,
right. Yeah.
yeah, it's like
That's all
no,
she is. I mean, you think, okay, here comes the last Gelfling, and it's like, oh, but there's another one, and it's a girl. And it's like, okay, yeah, this is definitely the love interest.
well, what a coincidence, you know?
Yeah.
It's just it's so she. I mean, they're trying to give us some character, like she has wings, and apparently boy Gelflings don't, and apparently she can talk to animals, a la Janna of the Jungle, and so she's kind of got those type of things with them, and also she was raised by another like race of like things that feel a bit uncomfortable. Really, they feel like stereotypes of something, which I'm not going to go into because I don't want to get this video demonetized. But I mean, like the thing about it just feels like Kira as a character just it basically just is like, oh hey, here's Jen but female. It's like there's no other differences between our two characters besides that.
Hmm. I mean, there is a difference though. She has a pet.
Oh yeah, buy the toys. Like it's just
Yeah,
hey everybody, here's animals' pubic hair. You know,
with large teeth
I
and
know.
growling. Yeah, so the pet Fizzgig, yeah, he pretty much is just the pet. He doesn't contribute anything in the plot. He's just there and barks and
Even
growls.
Jen points this out. It's almost like he's talking to the audience. It's like you provided nothing, no help whatsoever, in this, and he even points that out in the final acts, before he goes off and faces off against
The
Skeksis.
Sketsis.
Yeah, you know
Yeah.
what? I nearly keep calling him Skegness as like the the place in Scotland and all the scaffolding or whatever they're
Hmm.
called. Yeah, so the one thing also as well that's not really explained. Like, here's the thing with the Skeksis themselves. So you've got the general who is now emperor, which is like really, really confusing, and then you have the high priest, and then you have the scientist, the gormand, the Orientalist, and the scroll keeper, the slave master, the treasurer, and then you have Chamberlain. But quite frankly, only like probably like two and a half characters effectively get any sort of like developments in this. Chamberlain, the general, and probably the scientist, if
Yeah.
anything. And everybody else is just kind of like in the background,
Yeah,
pretty
pretty
much.
much. I mean, it's shown in the first part of the movie that there's only 10 of them left, and yet they rule the world. And I'm thinking, well, of course there's only 10 of them left. There's no women. What is it with these old fantasy stories and having no women in their group? It is a sausage fest.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, due to plot convenience, they're gonna last forever, but in any normal situation, they would have been dead a long time ago because there's nobody to procreate with.
Well, yeah, it's again like it's just so stupid, the way that it's kind of like done in this sense, and and also these one thing I was hoping for, I thought that would be really interesting would be that you see Chamberlain get kicked out because he's trying to challenge for the Emperor's throne, and obviously he's lost in the battle of like whacking a sword against a stone, which kind of makes no sense really.
I mean,
But
that's how they're able to choose who's going to be the emperor. If you hit the stone really, really hard, then you're the emperor.
yeah, and it's stupid. I'm
I
sorry,
mean,
but
you know what the Chamberlain kind of reminds me of?
what?
Starscream.
Oh, you know what? Now that you say that, I can see it now. Good
Yeah, think
grief.
about it because, Starscream was always wanting to be the ruler of the Decepticons, and he would do anything to do it. He's a coward and he manipulates, and then he tries to, get himself back over so that he can be with the Decepticons. It's the same thing with the Chamberlain.
Oh, wow.
The Chamberlain wants to be the ruler the moment that the first emperor dies, and then he's being challenged by the general saying, "No, you have to compete with me on this stone battle thingy." And then he loses, he's banished, and then he tries to weasel himself back over to the Sketsis by bringing in the Gelfling so that he can look good again. It's Starscream.
Yeah, what would be a better story for Chamberlain? Hear me out on this. So Chamberlain eventually gets thrown out, and they could have written it where like he thought that the other Skeksis would basically stand up for him and say, hey, look, he's still going to be like popular among the ranks, but then he gets tossed to the side, and then he has a change of heart and says, you know what, maybe these Gelflings, maybe have a point, and maybe like while he's going, right, following them around and seeing them like being helped out by Agra and being helped out by various other creatures amongst the world, and how that basically he gets to see things through their eyes rather than seeing things through the Skeksis. Maybe he could have turned around to them and say, hey, I want to stop, I want to fill this prophecy just as much as everybody else does, and you do well for them. Let me help you out and everything like that. And then they can have some interesting like back and forth between like Jen, Kira, and like and Chamberlain himself. Like hey, can we really trust this guy? And that could have been some interesting stories, like pad out the movie
Hmm.
effectively. But they chose not to do it, and Chamberlain's now just a one note effectively.
Yeah, I mean, he
Yeah.
comes across as like really forceful, saying like we need to bring the crystal over to the palace so that we can bring peace and prosperity again. And it doesn't come across as genuine, it comes across as really, really manipulative.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, but they could have written Chamberlain a lot better as an interesting character, in my opinion. Then maybe they could have they could have done like the redemption arc as well. Chamberlain realizes how much awful things that he's done, and maybe he in the final acts contributes to the fact that the crystal gets put back together. You
Yeah,
know.
and as for the general becoming the emperor, it's nothing out of the ordinary. He's just an evil guy who is the ruler of the Skeksis and the entire world, and he just wants to keep it that way.
I guarantee you, there's probably Saturday morning cartoon villains that are far more fleshed out than General.
You're not wrong.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there's some really terribly fleshed out, evildoers in our childhoods. I mean, but I think General takes the cake in regards to this. He's just evil for the sake of being evil. There's no backstory of why he does what he does, or there's no motivation in his character, and he doesn't really explain himself all that well, and we don't really learn anything. If anything, we learn more about his eating habits, and we learn more about him just walking around more than anything else.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, I understand that this movie was supposed to build up this interesting world and it was supposed to, have this really intriguing universe that we can like get ourselves invested into like, oh wow, look at these creatures, look at this plant life and look at this interesting lore about these crystals and about these inhabitants and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is that this is more style over substance. Like, yes, the world is interesting if you look at it, but it's the characters that we are invested in. It's like, sure, we have, the Lord of the Rings setting, and it's really interesting with all these different set pieces, but it wouldn't be interesting without Bilbo or Gandalf or Frodo or Samwise or Pip and Merry or Sauron or anything of the sort. Like, we wouldn't care at all about this world if the characters weren't interesting. That's why the Lord of the Rings stuff is still really popular to this day. That's why there's movies and TV shows on it. And with the Dark Crystal, they tried to do a sequel of this for decades, but it just fell off the wayside until in recent years when the movie became a cult classic was when they decided to dip in that well a second time because there's
Yeah.
not really much material to work with. Sure, you have an interesting world, but yeah, unfortunately, the set pieces and the characters are pretty one note and generic.
I don't want to call this a tech demo because
It's not a tech
yeah.
demo because Jim Henson had been doing puppet stuff for years.
Exactly, yeah. So, but the one thing I'll say about this is that I mean, I'm not too sure if it's worth going for into the rest of the characters really because there's not really much to kind of write home about really
No,
about.
not really.
Yeah, exactly. The Mystics themselves, they sound like really interesting characters, and you didn't really do anything with them except make them do the Lord of the Rings walk effectively.
Yeah, they literally do the Lord of the Rings walk. You're absolutely right. It's like, okay, we need to walk and walk and walk
and run and in some
and
certain
then
places.
and then chant. And
Exactly,
then
yeah.
realize that whenever that a Sketsis gets hurt or killed, then one of the Mystics gets hurt or killed. So yeah, there's that. But other than that, I mean, other than oh, well, the Mystics
But
raised Jen and they do a lot of chanting, and there's this connection with the Sketsis, there's really not much to them.
But it's when one of them when one of the Skeksis dies and then one of the Mystics dies, they all just kind of look to the side and and just shrug their shoulders and keep walking. It's like, oh
Yeah.
well. It's like,
Yeah.
Barry's gone. Oh well. It's like it's easy come, easy go. It's like, really?
Okay, that if you've been together for over 1,000 years and either one of you gets hurt or killed, you don't care?
Yeah,
It's
it's just
like,
like, yeah.
do you care more about the prophecy than your own companion?
Well, it's like it would have been different if we actually got a chance to spend some time with these characters, which we don't.
No,
And
we don't.
this is the thing, if we had chance to care about these characters, you build Characters. That's what they are. They're characters. They have feelings. They have thoughts. They have ideas. They have motivations. They have all sorts of things that go into them. And this is, I think, this is the biggest problem with the Dark Crystal. A not really good understanding of story and a not really good understanding of characters. And it's all in the puppetry, and it's all in the design, and it's all in like the magic of all of that. And all the Jim Henson magic is in that. Just don't, unfortunately, I have to say to everybody that you don't find too much in the story here and don't find too much in the characters because you won't find anything here.
Yeah, I mean, you're only getting like one third of the package. It's like, yes, you have an interesting world that you're looking at, but what's the story? What's the, what are the characters' motivations? What are their backstories? What are their emotions? What are their plans and what are their goals? Who are they? We don't know.
Yeah, just please explain, like please tell us a story. And not say that you have told a basic story, but I would like to know more, you know. And
Hmm.
So, I mean, now we moved away from like the characters and like the story. I mean, like, I guess we can go basically what everyone comes to see for a Jim Henson project, and that is in the puppetry and that is in the effects. And by the way, everybody, this is done superbly.
Yeah.
Like, and so, I like the way that the characters are designed. I like the way that they do like all the puppetry and everything like that. And they even go so as far as like put like like a whole person into like a suit and make them into like a creature of some kind. And I think they do a really good job of doing that. And now, I mean, like Return of Oz, I think probably does maybe does a little bit more into that. But I think when was Return of Oz, by the way?
Well, I mean,
Like,
Return of Oz was like a few years later, but you could
yeah, so to
argue.
be fair, I mean, like, Return of Oz kind of had like a couple of years on the Dark Crystal at that point, and so I think they had a bit more time to like, put more interesting elements into their effects. So the Dark Crystal, though, I think for the fact that it was the first attempt to try and do something like this, I think it was good in itself and
Yeah,
was
well,
a
I mean,
breakthrough.
there's two camps of it. One, it was based off of a pre-existing story. It's based off of the Oz books by L. Frank Baum. It was released in 1985, which is about like 3 years after Dark Crystal. And it's not just puppetry. They were able to do a lot more than just that. There was animatronics, there was stop motion animation, and also there's people in there. So yeah, there's a little bit more of an advantage that Return to Oz has compared to Dark Crystal. I wouldn't really compare the two, to be quite
I mean,
honest.
I won't compare the two either, but I mean, like, with the way that they did, certain things, I think, because there was those things that the Gelflings were riding, like, when they were putting like on
Oh,
stilts and
the
things.
Land Striders,
The Land
yeah.
Riders, yeah. Like, I mean, I saw like somewhat some like character. I mean, obviously they're different characters, but so they tried to do that as well with like when Returns was like those wheelie characters. If you remember,
Hmm.
like they as well, it kind of reminded me of that a little bit. And so. I just think that with what they've got here in this Jim Henson project, I think there's some really good background designs. There's some really there's times where you look at it and you feel like you are there, like in the world, going along in this adventure with this Gelfling. And they also do like all the grass effects and the effect. And also there's moments when you look like you're just looking at like something that's like part of the scenery, and then all of a sudden like they'll just move away, and then you realize, oh wait, they're the puppets. That like they do such a good job of like making the puppets and the scenery all like one. That the minute that something starts moving, it's like, oh wow, like I wasn't expecting that.
Hmm.
So they
Yeah,
did a good job with
absolutely.
that.
I mean, you could definitely tell that there was a lot of work put into the puppets. Like, you could tell that, I mean, clearly, like more than two or three people were operating this one puppet, and they were able to do it seamlessly with like the Landstriders or the Gelflings or the Mystics or the Sketsis. Like, you could tell that a lot of work was put into it. A lot of the designs are put into it, like the clothing and the designs of the Sketsis, where it's very fancy with all the jewelry and the fabric is like really well presented, while the Gelflings are wearing like plain brown clothing because they live in the forest and they're really poor. So yeah, there's a lot of variety in terms of the clothing, and you also have like the different textures in fur and with skin and with feathers. and with scaliness. So yeah, there's a lot of detail in the presentation with the characters and even the setting where it's, you have desert, you have the forest, you have the swamp, you have the cave. So yeah, just like with the classic fantasy, there's variety in creatures and in worlds and set pieces. So yeah, they got that down pack. It's just that the other things, like characters and story, is lacking. There's a reason why Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia and various other fantasy tales have stood the test of time, while Dark Crystal, again, we didn't get to see more of it until decades later. And I know that people were striving for it for the longest time. I remember all the way back in 2006 when I heard that they wanted to do a sequel to Dark Crystal, and Gendy Tartakovsky was even called in to be the director of it after he was done with Samurai Jack. But that plan fell through, and then they didn't get the funding for it. And, this was around the time in which when the Jim Henson Corporation were going through a lot of stuff. This was after they were bought off by Disney. And, even the Muppets weren't doing very well at that time. We'll talk about that at the end of the month. But yeah, I would say that Dark Crystal was definitely a film that didn't get its audience until many years later. And only until recently we got like the comics and then the Netflix series. And yeah, I would say that there is stuff there, but fortunately, I don't think there was much of an audience for it at that time to say, yeah, we want to see more of this stuff coming back.
Yeah. So, let's move on to the music, and I think is fantastic as well. I
Yeah.
think I believe that's who was it did the score again? I do apologize.
I
It
think it was
was
like Trevor Jones.
Trevor Jones, yeah, and Trevor Jones did a fantastic. The themes you immediately know them the minute you hear them. It's like, oh yeah, this is the Dark Crystal, and so
Hmm.
I think Trevor Jones has done a fantastic job in making us, recognize what it is the minute we hear it, and the fact that well, on top of that, it's not just the music that's like in the background. Like he had to basically create like an entire music, culture like for all these creatures that are like around like I think for but the race that's around raised Kira and then the Mystics themselves and even the Skeksis as well like he had to basically create all different types of music to like make us feel like we are in a different world and only kind of like up the orchestra effectively like when we need to go back into like the cinematics and so I think the fact that Trevor recognized when we're in the movie, when we're with these creatures, when we're in this world, when we're with the enemy, when we're with that, I think, in the film score, I think he's done that very well. And I love the music. In fact, I'm going to check to see if it's going to be on Apple Music and I might listen to it again because I love it.
Awesome.
I like it so much. So,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
you won't have to wait too long because Trevor also composed the next movie we're going to be talking about next time.
cool. Okay, then. But anyway, before we get into that, I think maybe we should score this movie.
All right then.
So, cool. Okay, then. So, here's the thing about this. I'm all in it for the Jim Henson, fantasy. I'm all in it for the world that this has built. I'm all in it for the music. I think all that is great, and I'm all in it for the effects, the puppets, and everything like that. Unfortunately, when you do a theatrical production, there are two vital components which are needed: your story and your characters. And right now, they are very, very lacking. And at the very end of it, I was like, I don't feel like I was immersed in a story. I just feel like I was part of like some kind of like event that kind of like took part, which involved a lot of effects and music and things like that. It felt more like going to see an orchestra and seeing like things on a screen rather than like going to through a cinematic production. So unfortunately, it does lack quite a lot in that department. So. A lot of people are going to probably disagree with me. A lot of people are going to agree with me, but I'm just going to go for it. I believe it's a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree. It feels more like you're playing an old 1980s fantasy video game. It's like, okay, you have this blank slate character, you're told the story that you're the chosen one, and you are meant to do this task that is supposed to restore peace into the world from these evil beings. And then you just go off and you just meet up with various characters along the way. They tell you a lot of exposition. You get the MacGuffin, and then you just keep going along the way. Maybe you'll meet up with a companion, and then the companion has her own set of skills and even little companions of her own. And then you just keep on going. Oh, here comes some trouble. You have to now fight off against these things, or you have to run away from them, depending on what the gameplay is. And then all of a sudden, you have a little snag that you have to get to. And then finally, you complete it, and then the credits roll the end. And yeah, I mean, it's a fun experience for a little bit, but then you realize, oh, well, I've experienced better things elsewhere, like Legend of Zelda or Dragon Quest or anything of the sort. I mean, it's a fun little game that I personally remember, but not a lot of people do. And, it's pretty decent when I was a kid, but then when you look back on it, it's like, yeah, I mean, we've come a long way from fantasy tales. And even back then, when I was a kid, when I knew about other fantasy tales, there were other stuff that were better. So, yeah, I mean, you still kind of have it in your mind, but for various reasons that, is feasible, like the music and also the set pieces and the world building. But as for characters and as for story, it's secondary. It's like it's secondary, like an old 1980s fantasy game. Gameplay comes first, story and characters are secondary. So yeah, I do agree. 6 out of 10.
Hmm. Okay, so that's it for this episode of In Search of the Crystal Skull. Patricia, what have we got coming up next?
All right, so because we talked about Dark Crystal, you know that we're going to be talking about Labyrinth next time.
Okay, and so until then, my name is Aaron.
My name is Patricia.
Take care and bye bye for now.
See you later.